Steve, welcome to the On the Mark podcast and Merrillism. I got to tell you something. I am really jazzed up and excited today because you and I, with probably, 70 plus years of experience and our friendship, and we're just going to talk about the insights community, talk about leadership, talk about the future and how we see it, legacy. We're just going all over the place, Steve. So welcome to the On the Mark podcast.
Thank you. Great to be here and excited to have the conversation with you.
Okay, Steve, we're going to start with this because this is taped prior to the Super Bowl. We know that Kansas City, who's got back-to-back, going for a three-peat. Let's start with something important to both of us. Who do you got in the big game in a week and a half?
Yeah, so I think smart money is on the Eagles. I think they're hot right now. I think very balanced team. Really, really good offense, really, really solid defense. I think they'll probably come through. I would love to see Mahomes get the three-peat because that's a pretty special thing, and I'm not sure when the next time we'll see somebody sort of go down that path. So what I'm really rooting for is a good game, something that goes down to the wire, something that keeps our interest for 4 quarters, and a well-played game, too, would be fun.
That's great. Well, I've got the Eagles as well. Fly, Eagles, fly. I think it's going to be a high-scoring game. I don't know if Kansas City is going to be able to stop the vaulted and vaunted offense of the Eagles and all their playmakers. And I think it's going to be a good game, though, and I'm excited about that. So, all right, let's get into it, Steve. Steve, amazing. We've been in this insights community our entire career, which when I was in college, I never thought that would happen. I always wanted to play left field for the Red Sox, but I had no skills or size to do that, so that was never going to happen. But we both end up in the insights community. And when you look back on your time and when you first started with, with your mom and doing focus groups basically in your house, right? All the crazy stuff. Did you ever think you would end up here 30 plus years later?
Yeah, no, I absolutely not. I think when I started out with my mom back in the mid 80s, I didn't know what the research world was truly about. I knew what my mom did for many years when I was growing up. I fell in love with it pretty quickly. But again, you never know where your career is going to go and, what's going to happen over time. And, I think back then, I don't even know if I thought about it all that much. I think you just went year after year and you sort of plowed forward and you hoped that each year was a better year and you did better for yourself, the company did better, and you moved on. And it's really interesting looking back at it, so many decades later and just sort of thinking about, the twists and turns and how the journey continued on and sort of, how I wound up where I am today versus where I was, really almost 40 years ago now. And I'm sure for you, the same thing, right? Even for you, you didn't necessarily have the family connection that I had with my mom, but most people wound up in this industry back then just by chance or just, it just happened. Yeah. And then all of a sudden, next thing you know, it is 20, 30, 40 years later. And, you've had this whole career. So how do you think about it? Like in terms of when you were, sort of in your 20s and you landed that first job and then sort of how your careers progressed?
It's interesting because both of our moms were instrumental in our careers. Without our moms, neither one of us would have ended up in the insights community. And my path was a little bit different because my mom didn't own a business and bring me into the business. But I was on the couch probably watching some show in my 20s, like Happy Days. And she came home and she goes, I just had the greatest experience of my life. She goes, I talked, I ate, and I got paid. And I went to a focus group and get off the couch, you bum. And here's back in the day, everybody, believe it or not, you filled out an application, not online because there was no online. You filled out with a broken pen or a pencil that wasn't sharpened, and you went down and you hand delivered this application. You filled it out, and I started as an interviewer. And that's how I started. I did door-to-door interviewing. I did mall intercepts. I did telephone interviewing. I did coding, and I loved it. And it gave me kind of a good foundation to kind of work my way up through the enterprise and through a number of companies. And it's, I so glad that I started as an interviewer because I think it was a great framework for me. So it just was. But, when we look back, Steve, your mom, when you were in the business, do you remember what the revenue was back then when you first started? Was it $1 million? Was it $2 million? What was it?
It was actually less than that. I think it was probably around $500,000.
So let's go I'm going to double it because it'll be better for numbers. So let's go to $1 million. Let's go to $1 million. And now, you've grown this to hundreds of millions of dollars more, right? So 250 plus times that. Well, if I said to you, you got to limit it to 2 or 3 defining moments when it was Schlesinger back then, and now it's obviously Sago now. But were there 2 or 3 defining moments that really propelled and turbocharged the increase in revenue over the decades?
So, I think that surely the first move we made, which was opening up our first focus group facility, there's no question that, sort of took us to into that line of work. And then, that was our first sort of stepping stone. And then, the next thing was really the idea that we could have multiple locations of facilities, and we grew there. And that was like sort of this next called chapter. And then partnered with, my business partner, Mike Sullivan, in 2000. And we really did that specifically to really grow the business in a much more exponential way. And, what's interesting there is that when I think about it, Mike's great. He's like a brother to me. And we've had a great run together for over 25 years now. But I think about the risk I took, not really knowing Mike all that well, but recognizing that I needed a real partner, somebody who could help me, sort of get to this next place. And he brought a whole bunch of skills that were very complementary to my skills. And that really helped us do so much more in such a short period of time. And then, we went on to then start acquiring businesses and expanding to Europe and getting involved in many things outside of qualitative with our quant offerings and our products and technology. And, all these things are truly chapters in the Sago, or at that time, Schlesinger Group story, now Sago story. And I think that is probably the case for many businesses where they have these chapters. Sometimes it's like, look at the Mark story, right? The original founders, then selling it to Omnicom, now them bringing you in, that's another chapter, then you taking over the business from Omnicom. I think about these things, and they are like sort of points in time where the business shifts and it changes. It doesn't happen overnight, but it changes when those things change.
Yeah, you bring up it's an amazing story all the way around. And, you bring up a really good word that I think lots of people don't think about. And I don't think I thought about it when I was younger in the business and probably had a lot less experience. And that's complementary skills. I want to expand on that for a second because I think it's important. When I think of the leadership team at Mark, and I think of Brad, Randy, Lynn, and myself, all of us are different, right? You've got a big brain, analytical guy. You've got Lynn, who's a great, what I'll call researcher. You've got Brad, who's a sales guy. And then I cut across all three. We're all different. And I think that sometimes people hire the exact same people they are. And it's not necessarily it's the people that fit into the business. It's almost like a comfort level, right? It's not a complementary situation. It's a comfort level. How do you agree with that? Do you view that the same way I do?
Well, I think that anytime you get a group of people who think the same way, sort of react the same way to, business problems or even business solutions, I think that's dangerous. I think you wind up sitting in a vacuum. It's like an echo chamber. All you're hearing is yourself, and everybody's agreeing, and there's no dissent or debate. And I think that that's really risky. I think what you ultimately want to have is you want to have people who bring different perspectives, people who've maybe grown up and had different experiences. I think it creates a more holistic, well-rounded view on things. And I think you ultimately make better decisions. But I also would say that it's really important that you create the environment where dissent is not only accepted, it's applauded. Where the fact that people can, argue, debate, and, really hash out challenging scenarios is fun. It's part of, the pleasure of the work, not just the fact that it becomes tense or uncomfortable. And, I think that when you do that, you get further faster. So I think about like my leadership team, people come from lots of different places. Some folks grew up in the business. Some people came from different companies. Some people came from smaller businesses. Some came from larger businesses. We try to create an environment where people can really put things on the table, get help, but also get challenged. And, that to me, I think really creates a much better dynamic. And frankly, it should be intentional, right, Merrill? I mean, like we should ask that question, like, is this a safe environment where we can talk about things and really debate them? Do you feel like you're being heard? I mean, I've had people within my group over the years say to me, I don't think you're hearing me. Like, I don't think that, you might be giving me the forum to talk, but are you really hearing me? And are you taking my opinions into account? Now, look, I may disagree with you, and I actually may make a decision ultimately that isn't the one that you favor, but it doesn't mean I didn't hear you. But it's good for you to challenge me on that too. That's okay. Like, it's okay for you to say, hey, did you really hear me? And I can say to you, I did hear you, but I disagree with you. And ultimately, I have to make the decision here. So sorry, it's going the other way.
Yeah. No, I think it's a good point. And I think, it's funny. I did a podcast about this maybe a month or two ago with Mike Tomlin, and it was kind of entitled Attention CEOs. Sometimes you got to be the Lone Ranger. And sometimes you got to make a decision. Sometimes CEOs see things that others don't or can't or won't want to. And sometimes we have to go against the grain. And look, hopefully a high percentage of time we're right. Every CEO is wrong at times, including myself and you as well. But sometimes you've got to make that hard decision. And I think that this is when, in the business environment today, Steve, I think it's really hard. This may be the hardest of two guys who grew up in the 80s in the business, and now, close to 40 years later, still involved in the business. This to me is the hardest that it's ever been. This is when you have to be on. This is when this is our Super Bowl. This is our putt on the 18th green of the Masters, or the 7th game of the World Series in the bottom of the 9th. We're about to see how good we are as CEOs navigating through this. But because we have a lot of CEOs that listen to this podcast, the reality is, what are some of the must-haves that CEOs really have to have now to navigate and have success through this business environment?
Well, yeah, there's a lot there to think through. I mean, I'd say that, when I think about the challenges that we're faced with, I think it's the things that are maybe different today are, the ability to move fast. Call it agility, right? The ability to make decisions quickly, the ability to recognize things faster. So if there's a certain challenge in your business, being able to spot that sooner versus later, because we don't have a lot of wiggle room to have a quarter go by and have not made an important decision. I think that it's the ability to look at the trends in the business and how much they're changing, and those changes happen more rapidly than they used to. So again, it's that ability to see things, maybe peek around corners a bit, just be aware so that we can actually make a move quicker. I think it's our talent. Are people really pulling their weight? Are they doing their job well? Do we need to think about, repositioning people, training them differently, or frankly, maybe they're not the right people in the right seats? And we have to think about that. And we don't have long timelines on that either, right? Everybody needs to be productive today. We can't have weakness, in anywhere along the team. And that really hurts the business. I think about just managing the changes with our clients. Our clients' lives are changing a heck of a lot more. You and I have perspective going back so long ago. Think about what clients' lives were like in the 90s and even the early 2000s. I mean, their lives weren't very different day in and day out, year after year. There was a lot of stability within the client set. They were doing a lot of the same work over and over again. Even if maybe the products were different, the type of work they were doing was very similar. That's not our world today at all. People are changing jobs all the time. People are in a company, out of a company. So if we're working with that company, we may have different stakeholders. They may have different agendas every quarter or every half a year. And how are we aware of that? And what are we doing about that? So I just think everything is changing faster. We have to be more nimble and agile and flexible. And I think if we do that well, I think we have greater chance of success. When we fail at that, and it's noticeable, because you look at it post-mortem, you realize that you missed the mark with a client, with a change in methodology, with a change in tech, whatever it might be.
Yeah. It's interesting with the wiggle room. As you were talking, Steve, I was thinking about my wiggle room in 2010 or 2012 when I was owned by Omnicom. And now, obviously, I own the business. My wiggle room is more now than it was then, right? And I think the opposite is true for you. When you and Mike owned the business and you didn't have a PE company attached to you, you had a lot of wiggle room. If you want to go and invest money, and maybe the ROI would be a year or two later or down the road, that was okay. That was a decision that you and Mike and your leadership team made. Now the wiggle room is a little bit less, right? I mean, when you think about it, and you probably are doing things a little bit, maybe forced to do things a little bit quicker than you may have done in the years past, right? It's kind of interesting, right? The way that things have turned around.
Yeah. Well, I would add an element of thought here, which is some of it you could say is PE backed or not. But the thing that's relevant about PE backed is not the fact that you have shareholders. It's around runway. And every business can think of runway differently. So for us, yes, because we have PE ownership, we have a runway, and the runway has a limitation to it. It's not an exact date and time, but it's a number of years, right? And we're now in our fifth year with our PE company, and really almost going into our sixth year. And, this is usually when, they want to sort of get the rewards of their investment and, look to bring new ownership in. So that's what we have to work with. For some people, it may be around those transaction timelines. For some people, it might be around retirement and considerations around that. For some people, it might be around, sort of what they're thinking about financially for the business and their risk profile. What I like about this conversation is that people sometimes just don't think about these things, right? They're head down, doing the work, moving day after day after day. And they might be thinking strategically about the business from a planning perspective that's around, the next year, 2, 3 years. But most of the time that is about like how they're servicing their clients or how they might think about growing their business. But I think you have to add to that the element of, well, what am I really trying to do with this business? Am I trying to sell it one day? Am I trying to run it with a certain purpose? Am I run it to have it be a certain size? Cover a certain amount of methodologies or geographies or client types. What is my real thinking there? And how does that figure into how I build my strategy? Because then you could talk about how I invest my money or how I take risk or, how I think about communicating with my team and what I'm looking to get from them and what I want them to understand about where we're going in this journey. So I think that that's where this whole runway thing, wiggle room, risk, profile or risk tolerance, all these things really come into play.
Those are some great points, Steve. We're going to pause here and save the rest of our discussion for a second episode. Ooh, excitement, which will focus on getting involved with the industry and our thoughts on the future of our insights industry. If you want to watch part 2 now, sign up for our weekly podcast or click the link above.